What happened to new atheism, or even old atheism for that matter? Let's talk about it. New atheism collapsed because it was never designed to evolve into a healthy, diverse, future oriented secular movement. It was a reactionary project held together by charismatic critique rather than constructive vision, and when its ideological glue dissolved, it fractured into two dysfunctional identities: Western conservatheism and American trolltheism. Both mirror the very hierarchies, hostilities, and hyper-control mechanisms that atheism once sought to escape. A sustainable secular future will require moving beyond these reactionary fragments and building a humanistic, community centered paradigm, grounded not in disbelief, but in people. Let's talk about the movement's drift from new atheism to post new atheism. What scholars now call New Atheism, which was the wave spanning roughly from 2004 to 2015, literally the year I graduated high school up until the year after I deconverted. This was held together by three major attractions that corresponded directly to the work and persona of each of the so called Four Horsemen: Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, Richard Dawkins, and Christopher Hitchens. My deconversion just so happened to be at the tail end of that movement. Now, first, its global focus emerged most clearly through Sam Harris, whose post 9/11 critique of religion framed theistic belief not as a local cultural tradition, but as an international security threat with geopolitical consequences. His work cast religion as a globalized force shaping violence, public policy, and cross cultural conflict, encouraging atheists to think beyond the parish and into the planetary. Now, second, its holistic concern was championed by Daniel Dennett, whose philosophical humanism pushed the movement to consider not just disbelief, but the broader architecture of secular ethics, cultural evolution, and the scientific study of religion. Dennett offered atheism a moral and sociological horizon, an attempt to articulate how societies might flourish without inherited religious. Now, third, its assertive critique of theistic harm was advanced most aggressively by Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens. Dawkins approached religion as a mimetic virus responsible for intellectual stagnation and scientific obstruction, while Hitchens cast religion as a political and moral catastrophe, indicting its historical and contemporary role in repression, violence, sexuality, and state power. Together, they gave the movement its confrontational edge, naming religion not simply as mistaken, but as materially harmful to human autonomy. But the influence of New Atheism did not remain confined to these four figures. As its popularity surged, it expanded into a much broader ecosystem of public intellectuals, debaters, and digital educators. Neil deGrasse Tyson and Bill Nye brought scientific literacy into mainstream entertainment. Lawrence Krauss, Ayaan Hirst Ali, and others extended its critiques into global politics, feminism, and human rights. YouTube debaters like Matt Dillahunty and the ACA ecosystem normalized public deconversion narratives and live argumentation as a cultural spectacle. This secondary wave turned New Atheism from a literary philosophical movement into a mass media identity, something accessible, performable, and infinitely replicable online. For nearly a decade, hundreds of creators, educators, and commentators were able to graft themselves onto the movement's energy, generating a decentralized, emotionally charged, and increasingly diverse audience whose needs could no longer be met by the original framework. And once the initial urgency faded, after the peak of the debate religion boom, the declining novelty of the horsemen, and the normalization of online disbelief, New Atheism began to lose internal cohesion. Sociologically, this follows a predictable arc. Social movements fracture when their enemies lose symbolic centrality, when their charismatic leaders cease to anchor the community, when the audience diversifies faster than the ideology can adapt, when intragroup power struggles intensify, and when identity policing replaces collective mobilization. The result is exactly what happened: a drift into fragmentation, competing orthodoxies, and a post New Atheist landscape where disbelief remained strong, but the movement that once unified it could no longer hold itself together. Now, as New Atheism expanded beyond its founding personalities and became a decentralized digital identity, the movement entered what sociologists call the post mobilization phase, a stage where enthusiasm remains high, but ideological coherence begins to erode. This erosion sets the conditions for fragmentation. The audience that once gathered around a unified critique of religion became demographically and psychologically heterogeneous. Early adopters were largely secular liberals and scientific enthusiasts, but the second wave introduced participants motivated by grievances unrelated to religion, cultural anxiety, anti progressive sentiment, online performativity, and even identity insecurity. When a movement's recruitment base diversifies faster than its ideological content, factions inevitably emerge to interpret the movement in their own image. Second, the loss of charismatic anchors, the horsemen, created a power vacuum. In secular movements, charismatic leadership often functions as a centripetal force, pulling competing interpretations toward a common center. Once the horsemen faded from prominence or became embroiled in controversy, authority dispersed into digital micro leaders. YouTube debaters, commentators, podcasters, and Twitter personalities. Without a coherent value system to regulate these new centers of influence, content creators begin shaping atheism according to platform incentives rather than philosophical commitments. The algorithm rewarded conflict, outrage, mockery, and ideological extremity, behaviors that accelerated factional differentiation. Now, third, the movement's original enemy, organized religion, declined in symbolic power. Younger generations already disidentified with religion, making its critiques less culturally urgent. In the absence of a strong external opponent, movements often turn inward. What had once been an outward facing campaign against theistic harm became an inward facing struggle over purity, tone, legitimacy, and ideological ownership. This shift from mobilization to identity policing is a classic sign of a movement entering fragmentation. Now, fourth, unresolved cultural tensions within the movement surfaced. New atheism had always contained contradictory impulses, an Enlightenment style universalism on one side and a Eurocentric culturally defensive rationalism on the other, an ethical humanist concern for human flourishing and a combative disdain for believers. As long as the movement had a shared target, these contradictions could be suppressed. Once the target lost urgency, the contradictions became organizing principles for splinter groups. Those drawn to cultural preservation drifted toward Western conservatheism, while those drawn to antagonistic spectacle and ideological combat gravitated towards American trolltheism. Finally, the digital environment accelerated the sorting process. Social identity theory shows that online spaces strengthen in group conformity and out group hostility. As atheist spaces grew more tribal and more performative, participants sorted themselves into factions that rewarded their preferred social behaviors: dominance, ridicule, certainty, or cultural protectionism. In this way, fragmentation was not merely an ideological split, but a sociological reorganization based on behavioral style, status incentives, and identity needs. These combined forces, diversifying audiences, weakened leadership, declining religious urgency, internal contradictions, and algorithmic tribalization, produced a post New Atheist landscape in which two distinct subcultures emerged as the dominant heirs: Western conservatheism and American trolltheism. Let's talk about Western conservatheism. Western conservatheism represents a fraction of contemporary atheism in which the critique of religion is no longer primarily a moral or epistemic project, but a cultural one, an instrument used to protect and reassert Western civilizational identity. In this subculture, disbelief becomes intertwined with commitments to traditional gender norms, colonial era hierarchies, anti immigrant sentiment, and Eurocentric moral assumptions. Although its adherents often speak in the language of objectivity, science, and reason, these appeals frequently function as a pseudo rationale veneer that masks deeper anxieties about demographic change, cultural displacement, and the perceived erosion of Western dominance. In this formulation, atheism is not a tool for expanding human freedom. Instead, it becomes a justification for cultural protectionism, where secular critique is inconsistently applied harshly toward non Western religions while remaining muted or even nostalgic about Western historical abuses. Sociologically, this group is engaged in cultural boundary maintenance, using atheism to redraw the line between what is civilized and what is primitive. Rather than dismantling oppressive structures, conservatheism reinforces them by framing Western cultural norms as inherently rational and superior, while casting non Western spiritualities as irrational, regressive, or dangerous. This dynamic reproduces a long colonial tradition, the belief that Western secularism is a universal standard against which all other cultural expressions must be measured. In practice, this means that critiques of Hinduism, Islam, or African traditional religions often operate less as neutral secular analysis and more as coded affirmations of racial hierarchy. The insistence that we, Western atheists, represent progress, science, and modernity, while they represent superstition, tribalism, or backwardness, reproduces the very imperial logic the movement claims to oppose. Another defining feature of Western conservatheism is its patriarchal alignment, expressed through rigid policing of gender roles and masculine identity. These spaces disproportionately elevate men who frame rationality as a masculine virtue and emotion or empathy as feminine liabilities. This mirrors right wing digital ecosystems, including the manosphere, where appeals to evolutionary psychology are used not as empirical frameworks, but as ideological tools to legitimize male dominance and female subordination. Even when framed as scientific truth, these narratives function sociologically like secularized versions of religious patriarchy, replacing scripture with selective biology but preserving the hierarchy. As a result, conservatheist communities often replicate the very authoritarian gender structures traditionally upheld by conservative religious groups, despite their explicit rejection of religious doctrine. This subculture also exhibits clear colonial continuities. Although many of its inheritors claim to oppose religion in all forms, their harshest critiques almost always target non Western religions, especially Islam and Hinduism, while Western cultural heritage is reinterpreted through a sanitized, superiority driven lens. Islamophobic rhetoric in these spaces often mirrors far right political movements, not because of theological disagreement, but because Islam is symbolically associated with immigrants, refugees, and radicalized others. Criticisms of Hinduism or African religions frequently rely on stereotypes rooted in colonial discourse, positioning Western atheists as enlightened arbiters of civilization. By presenting these critiques as objective secular analysis, conservatheism disguises racial and cultural hierarchy as rational inquiry. These dynamics feed directly into a broader political drift to the right. Many within conservatheism adopt positions that, while secular in form, are structurally identical to the religious conservatism they claim to reject. Anti feminist rhetoric that pathologizes gender equality, anti DEI arguments that frame diversity as a threat to scientific integrity, anti immigration talking points rooted in cultural fear, and clash of civilizations narratives that echo Samuel Huntington more than secular humanism. Even without religious belief, these orientations function sociologically as quasi religious identity systems, offering moral certainty, group belonging, and a mythic narrative of civilizational conflict. Ultimately, Western conservatheism reveals how atheism can slide seamlessly into authoritarianism when it becomes a cultural identity rather than an intellectual or ethical one. By weaponizing secular critique in defense of hierarchy, racial, gendered, and civilizational, this faction demonstrates that rejecting religion does not necessarily equate to rejecting the social structures that religion historically upheld. It exposes how disbelief, when untethered from humanism, can become a tool not for liberation, but for preserving social dominance. But there is another group, American Trolltheism. American Trolltheism represents a faction of atheism in which disbelief is no longer rooted in inquiry, critique, or philosophical clarity, but in performance. In this subculture, atheism becomes an expressive style rather than an intellectual position, an identity enacted through trolling theists, belittling believers, escalating conflicts, and policing the behavior of other atheists. Rather than engaging religious ideas with analytic rigor, trolltheism prioritizes spectacle, public humiliation, verbal domination, and algorithm friendly outrage. Its defining impulse is not the pursuit of truth, but the pursuit of impact measured in views, comments, shares, and emotional reactions. This makes it less a worldview and more a form of entertainment, shaped by the incentives of digital platforms that reward provocation over substance and aggression over understanding. Sociologically, this faction forms through antagonistic identity formation, where the self is defined entirely in negation. Trotheists do not articulate a constructive vision of a secular society, nor do they invest in ethical or philosophical frameworks. Instead, their identity coheres around opposition, being against religion, against believers, against the right, and increasingly against anyone within secular spaces who expresses nuance, empathy, or intellectual humility. This style thrives in arenas built for confrontation: YouTube debate culture, Reddit atheism forums, Discord argument channels, TikTok response videos, and organized dogpiling. These environments reward individuals not for depth or insight, but for rhetorical aggression and viral conflict. The community that forms around this dynamic becomes less a movement and more a performance troupe engaged in a never ending theater of antagonism. A hallmark of American trolltheism is its high demand for ideological purity. Any atheist who suggests that religion can have social complexity, cultural value, or historical nuance is immediately dismissed as accommodationist, soft, or not a real atheist. Those who promote secular community building, intersectional analysis, or trauma informed approaches to deconversion are treated as threats because their presence destabilizes the performative hierarchy on which trolltheism depends. This produces a digital form of sectarianism where internal policing, purity test, and boundary enforcement take precedence over public engagement or intellectual growth. The goal is less to understand religion and more to maintain a rigid group identity through exclusion. These dynamics feed a pattern of internal aggression where troll theists attack fellow atheists more fiercely than they attack religion itself. This inversion occurs because the highest form of social capital in these spaces is not insight, but dominance display. Crushing a believer earns points. Crushing another atheist earns status. The aggression is fueled by insecurity, performance cruelty, and a constant need to reaffirm group loyalty through humiliating someone deemed insufficiently combative. This creates a lynch mob ethos in digital spaces where mobs form quickly, accountability disappears, and the spectacle of collective punishment becomes a ritual of belonging. The hostility is less ideological and more sociological, a mechanism for reinforcing in group cohesion through targeted outgroup aggression, even when the outgroup is another atheist. Underlying all of this is the role of platform economies. Trolltheism is not merely a cultural trend, it is a product of the attention economy that shapes modern digital life. Algorithms reward content that triggers strong emotional reactions, anger, amusement, outrage, and punish content that requires reflection or complexity. Because rage and humiliation generate more engagement than education or bridge building, troll theists gravitate toward behaviors that yield the highest return: dunking on theists, mocking religious trauma survivors, escalating fights, and sensationalizing conflict. In such an environment, constructive secularism, community building, ethical humanism, social justice engagement cannot compete with the dopamine hits of virality. Thus, many trotheists are not actually interested in the growth of secular thought or the improvement of secular communities. They are interested in producing content, even if that content undermines the very goals atheism. Taken together, American trotheism shows how a movement that began with intellectual ambition can devolve into an entertainment subculture driven by spectacle, antagonism, and algorithmic reward. It illustrates the vulnerability of secular discourse when stripped of its ethical commitments, revealing how quickly disbelief can be weaponized for social performance rather than human progress. The fragmentation of new atheism into these distinct camps can only be understood by recognizing how profoundly dependent the movement was on the gravitational pull of its early thought leaders, the Four Horsemen: Harris, Dawkins, Dennett, and Hitchens. They function as a rare moment of centralized authority within a community that otherwise resisted institutional structure. What unified the movement was not merely their celebrity, but the coherence of their framing. Each presented religion not simply as false, but as harmful, and each articulated that harm through a distinct lens: geopolitics for Harris, cognitive science for Dennett, scientific integrity for Dawkins, and historical political critique for Hitchens. Their presentations were polished, literary, intellectually accessible, and emotionally resonant. And perhaps most importantly, locked into their areas of expertise. They offered atheists not just arguments, but a shared moral narrative that religious belief is not a private error, but a public danger. Yet we lost them in different ways. Hitchens and Dennett passed away. Harris drifted into culture war politics, losing credibility among progressives. Dawkins increasingly alienated his own audience through inflammatory commentary that overshadowed his earlier scientific contributions. And no one emerged with comparable intellectual breadth, rhetorical force, or moral clarity to replace them. There were some, like Matt Dillahunty, who briefly appeared poised to inherit the mantle, functioning as the most prominent debate tactician of the second wave. But even his platform was shaped by a different ecosystem: live call ins, reactive debates, and online disputes. Instead of expanding the moral architecture of atheism, he became trapped in the entertainment economy of gotcha moments, interpersonal drama, and purity battles. Instead of becoming a generational thought leader, he becomes a polarizing figure in a digital arena that no longer rewarded nuance, humility, or vision casting. As a result, atheism lost its center of gravity at precisely the moment when the movement needed someone capable of articulating a new constructive direction. With the loss of unified leadership, atheism underwent what sociologists call identity politics of non belief. Once the central philosophical project dissolved, atheists increasingly defined themselves through the tribal belonging rather than intellectual commitment. In the absence of shared purpose, the movement fractured into purity contests: who's the real atheist, who's sufficiently combative, who's too soft, who's too political, who's not political enough, who's too compassionate. Tribes always require boundaries, and boundaries require enforcement. So hierarchy filled the void. Without leaders, the loudest voices, not the wisest, set the tone. The situation was intensified by the trauma of deconversion, an under-acknowledged component of new atheism's emotional landscape. Many atheists were not simply leaving belief, they were escaping authoritarian families, high-demand religious environments, and decades of fear-based conditioning. Without spaces for healing, emotional processing, or identity reconstruction, that internal chaos easily mutated into external aggression. Rage baiting works in trolltheist communities precisely because it taps into unprocessed wounds. More troubling is the reality that many within these circles openly struggle with depression, anxiety, self loathing, loneliness, and existential despair, yet these vulnerabilities are rarely addressed. Instead, they are cultivated, aestheticized, and performed as a badge of honor. The result is a subculture that is not only failing to heal its wounds, but exacerbating them, where individuals are literally making themselves sick, blaming the world for their deterioration, and refusing to disengage from the digital stimuli that triggered them. Turn off the TV, disconnect from the internet, unplug from the matrix, and breathe, beloved. Because no movement can rise from people who are actively burning themselves out. Layered atop these psychological dynamics is the structural force of algorithmic radicalization. Modern platforms do not reward humanism, complexity, or community building. They reward outrage, absolutism, conflict, humiliation, and cultural war framing. The algorithm amplifies conservatheism and trolltheism because they are high friction, high engagement, high emotion ecosystems. Meanwhile, humanistic atheism, focused on growth, liberation, ethics, and social progress, struggles for visibility. The content that uplifts rarely goes viral. The content that heals rarely trends. The content that builds community rarely survives the scroll. That's exactly why my content, the conversations that liberate, uplift, and inspire, looks the way it does. It's why I collaborate with the people that I do. It's why our events focus on personal and community development, because nothing changes until people are in a position to change it themselves. And sucking on the nipple of the algorithm is not going to get us there. And so finally, caught between the extremes are the silent middle, the largest yet least visible group in the post New Atheist landscape. These are the atheists who want secular community without cruelty, skepticism without cynicism, reason without dehumanization, and identity without ideological warfare. I shouldn't have to fight with you about who the hell I am. Who the hell are you? People are exhausted by conservatheist culture wars and repelled by trolltheist aggression. They crave intellectual honesty, ethical clarity, emotional grounding, and a sense of belonging that doesn't require worshiping a figurehead or participating in digital dog piles. The middle is not apathetic, they are underserved. They are not disengaged, they are unrepresented, and they are not lost. They are waiting for a secular space that treats them as humans, not algorithms. Despite their surface level differences, Western conservatheism and American trolltheism share a set of deeper structural similarities that reveal why both factions feel less like evolutionary branches of secular thought and more like dysfunctional offshoots trapped in the shadows of new atheism's collapse. First and foremost, both groups are fundamentally reactionary. Conservatheism reacts to cultural shift, demographic change, feminist progress, the decline of Western dominance, by using atheism as a shield to defend a nostalgic vision of the past. Trolltheism, by contrast, reacts to interpersonal conflict and the remnants of religious power by turning disbelief into a weapon of retaliation. One is terrified of societal change, the other is addicted to antagonism, but both are defined by what they oppose rather than what they imagine, mired in reflexive responsive rather than generative ideas. This reactionary posture inevitably leads both groups to reinforce hierarchy, even as they claim to have liberated themselves from religious structures. Conservatheism reasserts colonial and patriarchal norms under the guise of rational superiority, while trolltheism cultivates its own hierarchy, one built on dominance, humiliation, and rhetorical brutality. In each case, hierarchy is not dismantled, it is merely secularized. The very power structures these groups claim to reject reappear in new forms. The authoritarian father figure becomes the authoritarian debater. The doctrinal purity of religious orthodoxy becomes the ideological purity test of atheist gatekeeping. The architecture of domination remains intact. A third shared feature is that neither group is building a future. Both are locked in a kind of emotional and intellectual stasis, trapped in antagonism toward religion rather than articulating a post religious ethic or vision. Instead of moving beyond belief, they're tethered to it, like an abused person who's become fixated on their abuser, unable to imagine a life beyond the trauma. Conservatheism obsesses over cultural threats associated with non Western religions. Trolltheism obsesses over humiliating believers and refighting battles that should have been resolved decades ago. In this way, both factions remain psychologically captured by the very systems they claim to have escaped. Finally, both factions constrain diversity in secular spaces, which explains why the secular landscape feels culturally stagnant even as the number of non-believers grow. Black atheists, women, queer individuals, global South secularists, trauma-aware thinkers, and anyone operating with nuance are regularly ignored, tokenized, sidelined, or outright attacked. Conservatheism sidelines them through racial and cultural exclusion. Trolltheism sidelines them through performative cruelty, anti intellectualism, and disdain for complexity. The result is a secular ecosystem that reproduces the same exclusions found in religious institutions. Only certain identities are welcome, only certain voices are elevated, and only certain forms of acceptable non belief are permitted. Together, these shared traits show that the problem is not merely that atheism has fractured, it is that its loudest factions have lost contact with the humanistic, future oriented, community building aspirations that could have transformed secular life into something meaningful and liberatory. Instead, they have become mirror images of the very forces they oppose, leaving a vast and underserved population of non believers searching for a secular identity that is not rooted in reaction, aggression, or exclusion. So, what we are witnessing today is not merely a shift in tone or generational taste, it is the institutional breakdown of New Atheism itself. The movement was never structurally designed to sustain diversity, to nurture community, to address emotional or psychological needs, to embrace sociological complexity, or to imagine multi ethnic secular futures. It had no mechanisms for building solidarity, no frameworks for care, and no blueprint for belonging. Its power came from its ability to dismantle, not its ability to construct. So when the ideological glue that held it together dissolved, when the horsemen faded, when the novelty of public deconversion wore off, when the internet decentralized authority, the movement predictably split into its most reactive components: Western conservatheism, where atheism was absorbed into the cultural war conservatism, and American trolltheism, where atheism was absorbed into digital antagonism. Both are defensive, backward looking shells of a movement that once claimed to be forward thinking. And this is the real problem, isn't it? The fact that new atheism wasn't designed to do any of the things a lasting movement requires is not an aberration. It is the norm. New atheism was itself a reactionary framework, a necessary reaction, perhaps, but still a reaction. It dismantled old structures without building new ones. It deconstructed belief without constructing solidarity. It exposed harm without cultivating healing. And part of the reason it could never evolve beyond that is what I would call the futility of atheist arrogance. This arrogance shows up in the overassertion, loud, proud, and endlessly repeated, that atheism is nothing but a position, a mere answer to a single question, and therefore has nothing to organize around, nothing to unify for, nothing to build together. And yet these same individuals have fucking endless commentary about politics, ethics, identity, culture, religion, and society, somehow able to pontificate on everything while insisting atheism has nothing to do. How is it that your atheism has so much to say and yet so little to do? If atheism were truly just a position, then your atheism should have no commentary on anything other than the existence or non existence of a deity. But that's not the reality, is it? Because atheism is nothing more than a proposition. Yes, but atheists are people, and people are enough reason to organize. People are enough reason to unify. People are enough reason to build community. People are enough reason to imagine more than critique. If you cannot understand that, if you cannot grasp that human beings are worth gathering for, worth building for, worth protecting and nurturing, then all you are is an atheist. Nothing more, no vision, no ethic, no commitment to the world you live in, and I pity you for it. The future of secular life cannot be built on reaction, arrogance, or antagonism. It must be rooted in humanism, community, global awareness, and secular ethics. The question before us is no longer, does God exist? Why are we even wasting time with that? The question now is, what do we build now that we no longer believe? And it is in answering that question, not the old ones, that the next chapter of secular life will be written. Listen, if you believe that people matter more than ideas, doctrines, or even politics, consider Bridge City. We're building a community where people matter, and our mission is to intentionally find ways to connect better and build better so that we can all live better. We're creating safe spaces where people can show up as their authentic selves and belong and make a difference without fear of having their lives and beliefs subjected to ideological purity tests. On top of our growing roster of events, we host conversations, clubs, and courses that not only inspire, but also create opportunity for others to grow and to build. From food drives to game nights to answering life's big questions together, we are on a bridge to better, and we'd love to have you aboard. If this resonates with you, make sure you report to the bridge by visiting bridgecity.app/start-here. And don't forget to introduce yourself when you make it in. As always, if you want to support the work that we're doing here, the links are in the description. I am incredibly grateful for our partners, our sponsors, and our donors who are empowering us to change the world without having to play politics. Our campaign is global. Our constituents are everyone. And our firm affirmation is that together we can build bridges to a better tomorrow. Thank you for hanging out with me. And until next time, keep rising.